September 19th, 1942, Guidonia Airfield, 20 kilometers northeast of Rome. Test pilot Colonnello Angelo Tondi circles the captured Spitfire Mark V at 8,000 feet, banking through the crystalline Italian morning. The British fighter handles beautifully, responds crisply, climbs with authority. Below him, engineers from the Centro Sperimentale cluster around calculation tables, timing his ascent with stopwatches. Tondi doesn't know it yet, but in the next 40 minutes, he will shatter a comfortable illusion that has sustained Italian fighter doctrine for nearly 2 years. For months, Italian pilots flying the Macchi C.202 Folgore had been trading blows with British Spitfires over Malta and North Africa. The Italians knew the numbers. Their Folgore could outturn the Spitfire, could match it in a knife fight, could, according to combat reports and official assessments, hold its own against anything the Royal Air Force threw into Mediterranean skies. But they had never flown one, never felt its power delivery across the altitude band, never measured, systematically and scientifically, exactly where their own fighter stood in the hierarchy of aerial combat. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Spitfire had arrived at Guidonia 3 weeks earlier, forced down near Marina di Ragusa after combat damage severed its hydraulic lines. The pilot, a sergeant from RAF No. 69 Squadron, belly landed in a wheat field and was taken prisoner. His aircraft, aside from a buckled prop and some panel damage, remained largely intact. Italian recovery teams transported it north under heavy guard. By early September, technicians at the experimental centre had replaced the propeller, patched the hydraulics, and declared it airworthy. The Macchi C.202 had been Italy's answer to mediocrity. For years, Italian fighters had struggled with inadequate power plants. The Macchi C.202, though beautifully maneuverable, could barely exceed 310 miles per hour. Its radial engine, a Fiat A74 producing 870 horsepower, left Italian pilots at a systematic disadvantage against modern British and German fighters. Italy's aviation industry lacked the metallurgical expertise and production capacity to develop indigenous inline engines comparable to the Rolls-Royce Merlin or Daimler-Benz 601. The solution came from Germany. In late 1939, Alfa Romeo acquired a license to produce the Daimler-Benz 601AA as the Alfa Romeo RA1000. The engine, a liquid-cooled inverted V12, generated 1,175 horsepower, a 35% increase over the best Italian radial designs. Mario Castaldi, chief designer at Aeronautica Macchi, recognized immediately that mating this engine to the Saetta airframe could transform Italian fighter capability. The prototype first flew in August 1940. Test pilots at Guidonia recorded a maximum speed of 372 miles per hour at 18,000 feet. Altitude of 18,000 feet achieved in 6 minutes. Rate of climb at sea level exceeding 3,500 feet per minute. Turn radius superior to both the Hurricane and early Spitfire marks. The figures suggested Italy had closed the performance gap with frontline Allied fighters. Production began in May 1941. By September 1942, the Folgore equipped the backbone of Italian fighter strength. 51 Stormo flew them over Malta. Stormo numbers 1, 2, 4, and 54 deployed them across North Africa. The aircraft accumulated an impressive combat record. Over Malta during mid-1942, 51 Stormo claimed 97 Allied aircraft destroyed for the loss of only 17 Folgores. Pilots like Capitano Furio, Nicolo Doglio, and Sergente Ennio Tarantola became aces flying the type. The Macchi proved it could kill Spitfires in combat, but combat claims told only part of the story. Aerial engagements over Malta and the Western Desert occurred primarily at altitudes below 15,000 feet, where the Folgore's strengths emerged most clearly. Italian doctrine emphasized visual combat, tight formations requiring constant communication, and dogfighting tactics that exploited turning performance. Pilots learned to engage British fighters in slow-speed maneuvering battles, where the Macchis' light wing, loading and excellent roll rate provided decisive advantages. The British, however, had begun changing their tactics. After the introduction of the Focke-Wulf 190 along the Channel front exposed the Spitfire Mark V's limitations in high-speed combat, RAF Fighter Command revised its operational procedures. Spitfire units increasingly employed boom and zoom tactics, using altitude advantage to build speed before diving onto enemy formations. The new approach minimized turning combat, instead emphasizing high-speed firing passes followed by climbing disengagement using superior engine power. Italian pilots noticed the shift. After April 1942, British fighters over Malta showed less willingness to engage in sustained turning battles. Spitfire sections bounced Italian formations from above, fired brief bursts, then climbed away before the Macchis could respond effectively. Italian pilots found themselves chasing adversaries that refused to fight on Italian terms. Combat reports noted the frustration. Spitfires would not turn, would not stay and fight, would climb away and reset for another high-speed pass. At Guidonia, engineers prepared the captured Spitfire with methodical precision. They weighed every component, measured control surface areas, calibrated instruments against Italian standards. The fighter, a Mark V from early 1942 production, carried the standard armament of two 20mm Hispano cannons and 4303 caliber Browning machine guns. Armor protection included bulletproof glass forward of the windscreen, an armored pilot seat back, and steel plating around fuel tanks and engine components. The weight differential surprised Italian technicians. Fully loaded, the Spitfire weighed 6,417 pounds, nearly 700 pounds heavier than a similarly equipped Folgore. The additional weight came primarily from protective systems Italian designers had deliberately omitted. The Macchi carried no armor plating behind the pilot seat, no bulletproof glass. Fuel tanks used standard aluminum construction without self-sealing compounds. Every kilogram saved translated into improved climb rate and turning performance, but at the cost of pilot survivability. Colonnello Tondi lifted off from Guidonia at 08:15 on September 19th. He had logged over 2,000 hours in Italian fighters, including extensive time in captured Allied aircraft. The Spitfire felt solid during takeoff roll, tracking straight despite a narrow undercarriage. Initial climb proved impressive, the Merlin 45 engine pulling the fighter upward at approximately 2,600 feet per minute. Control response felt crisp and immediate. Tondi levelled at 5,000 feet and began the systematic evaluation that would occupy the next several flights. The first shock came during high-speed runs. Tondi pushed the throttle forward and trimmed for level flight at 15,000 feet. The Spitfire accelerated smoothly past 300 miles per hour, through 320, 340. At 360 miles per hour, the fighter remained completely controllable, ailerons responding crisply to stick inputs. Tondi experimented with high-speed rolling maneuvers. The Spitfire rolled cleanly and predictably, with none of the control stiffening that plagued the Folgore above 300 miles per hour. He made careful notes during the post-flight debrief. The British fighter's control harmony remained excellent throughout its speed range. Where the Macchis' fabric-covered control surfaces became heavy and unresponsive above 320 miles per hour, the Spitfire's metal construction maintained consistent feel and effectiveness. This characteristic alone explained the British tactical shift toward high-speed combat. Spitfire pilots could exploit speed regimes where Italian fighters became dangerously compromised. The altitude testing revealed more troubling disparities. Tondi climbed the Spitfire to 20,000 feet, noting power delivery and control response throughout the ascent. At 15,000 feet, the Merlin's single-stage supercharger maintained strong manifold pressure, engine performance barely degrading from sea level. Output. The Folgore's Alfa Romeo engine, by contrast, began losing power significantly above 12,000 feet. Its supercharger design, optimized for low-altitude operations, could not maintain adequate boost pressure in thinner air. At 20,000 feet, Tondi leveled the Spitfire and attempted combat maneuvers. The fighter responded crisply, turning cleanly through coordinated maneuvers that would leave a Folgore wallowing. He attempted a maximum rate climb from 20,000 feet. The Spitfire continued ascending at nearly 2,000 feet per minute, a rate the Macchi could not match even at sea level. The implications were devastating. British fighters operating above 18,000 feet existed in a performance realm Italian fighters simply could not access effectively. The engineers at Guidonia compiled data from multiple test flights. Tondi flew the Spitfire 9 times between September 19th and October 3rd, exploring its performance envelope systematically. Each flight revealed new disparities between British and Italian fighter doctrine. The numbers told a brutal story. Below 10,000 feet, the Macchi C.202 could match or exceed Spitfire climb performance. The Italian fighters' superior power-to-weight ratio at low altitudes provided genuine combat advantage in the visual range knife fights Italian doctrine emphasized. But above 15,000 feet, the performance equation reversed decisively. The Spitfire's rate of climb at 18,000 feet exceeded the Folgore's sea level maximum by nearly 20%. At 25,000 feet, the British fighter could still climb at 1,500 feet per minute, while the Macchi struggled to maintain 500. The altitude band, where modern air combat increasingly occurred, belonged entirely to aircraft with superior supercharging and structural strength for high-speed maneuvering. The structural testing revealed equally significant differences. Italian engineers conducted stress analysis on both airframes, comparing construction philosophies. The Spitfire's wing structure featured massive main spars with deep cross-sections, capable of withstanding loading factors exceeding 11 G. The skin, though thin, was supported by closely spaced ribs that prevented buckling under high-speed loads. Every structural element incorporated safety margins that would horrify weight-conscious Italian designers. The Macchi's wing, by contrast, used minimum-gauge materials throughout. Main spar depth was barely adequate for expected combat loads. Rib spacing prioritized weight savings over structural redundancy. The beautiful elliptical planform that gave the Folgore its elegant appearance came at the cost of structural efficiency. Under high-G maneuvering, particularly at speeds above 300 miles per hour, the Macchi's wings flexed visibly. Pilots reported alarming buffeting during maximum rate turns at combat speeds. Armament. Analysis highlighted another critical disparity. The Spitfire's two 20mm Hispano cannons each carried 120 rounds, providing approximately 15 seconds of sustained fire. The 4 Browning machine guns added 450 rounds per gun, extending engagement time significantly. Total ammunition weight exceeded 300 pounds, but the investment in killing power proved worthwhile against increasingly armoured targets. The Folgore carried 2 Breda Safat 12.7mm machine guns with 360 rounds each. Some variants added 2 7.7mm guns in the wings, but most pilots removed them due to their ineffectiveness against modern aircraft. Total ammunition weight barely exceeded 100 pounds. Italian pilots faced constant ammunition discipline problems, running dry after brief engagements while British fighters continued firing. The fuel system comparison proved particularly revealing. The Spitfire's self-sealing tanks used multiple layers of vulcanized rubber compounds that swelled when punctured by bullets, dramatically reducing fire risk. British engineers had invested significant weight in these protective systems after combat experience revealed fuel fires as the primary cause of pilot casualties. The additional complexity and weight proved worthwhile. Spitfire pilots could survive hits that would prove instantly fatal in unprotected fighters. The Macchi's fuel tanks offered no protection whatsoever. A single incendiary round striking the main tank, located directly behind the pilot seat, would ignite aviation gasoline within seconds. Italian pilots flew essentially unarmoured aircraft where any significant battle damage proved catastrophic. The design philosophy prioritized performance metrics over survivability, a trade-off that looked increasingly questionable as the air war intensified. Engine reliability presented yet another challenge. The Rolls-Royce Merlin, though mechanically complex, featured tight manufacturing tolerances and extensive quality control. British engines routinely operated for 500 hours between major overhauls, maintaining consistent power output throughout their service life. The careful metallurgy and precision machining that characterized British industrial practice produced power plants that performed as advertised across diverse operating conditions. The Alfa Romeo RA 1000, though based on the proven Daimler-Benz design, suffered from Italian industrial limitations. Metallurgical inconsistencies led to premature bearing failures. Quality control problems resulted in significant variation between individual engines. Some units performed beautifully. Others required major overhaul after 100 hours. Pilots learned to baby their engines, avoiding sustained high-power operations that could precipitate catastrophic failures far from friendly airfields. By early October 1942, the Guidonia evaluation concluded. Colonnello Tondi's final report documented the systematic performance analysis in clinical detail. The captured Spitfire would remain at the test centre for further evaluation, but the initial assessment provided everything Italian aviation authorities needed to understand their fighter force's actual competitive position. The report made uncomfortable reading for officials who had believed the Macchi C.202 placed Italy on par with Britain and Germany in fighter capability. The immediate reality was more complex and more troubling. Below 12,000 feet, in visual range engagements where Italian pilots could exploit turning performance, the Folgore remained genuinely competitive. Against Hurricane and early P-40 variants, the Macchi held decisive advantages. But the air war was moving upward and faster. American heavy bombers operated routinely above 25,000 feet. British fighter sweeps increasingly launched them from altitude, using energy advantage to dictate engagement terms. German doctrine on the Eastern Front emphasized boom and zoom tactics from height. The aircraft Italian pilots had been flying existed in a tactical envelope that was rapidly closing. The comfortable narrative that skill and maneuverability could overcome raw performance began collapsing under systematic analysis. Guidonia's test results demonstrated what combat pilots had been experiencing but could not quantify. The Spitfire wasn't just different. It was built for a different kind of war. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The climb rate differential told the most devastating story. At sea level, the Macchi C.202 achieved 3,563 feet per minute, genuinely impressive performance that exceeded the Spitfire Mark V's initial climb rate by approximately 20%. Italian test pilots celebrating this figure missed the broader picture. Combat rarely occurred at sea level. The air battles over Malta, North Africa, and increasingly over Italy itself took place at altitudes where the Folgore's advantages evaporated. At 10,000 feet, the climb rates converged. Both fighters managed approximately 3,000 feet per minute, but as altitude increased, the divergence became catastrophic. At 15,000 feet, the Spitfire maintained 2,600 feet per minute, while the Macchi dropped to 1,900. At 20,000 feet, where American heavy bombers cruised and where British fighters established their combat air patrols, the Spitfire still climbed at over 2,000 feet per minute. The Folgore struggled to achieve 1,200. The mathematics were brutal. A Spitfire formation at 25,000 feet holding combat air patrol could spot Italian fighters climbing from below and had multiple minutes to position for attack before the Macchis reached effective combat altitude. The British could dive, build crushing speed, execute a single, devastating firing pass, then climb away using superior power and altitude. Italian pilots could not pursue, could not reset, could only watch as their opponents climbed back to altitude and prepared another attack. Italian combat reports from late 1942 began reflecting this tactical reality with increasing clarity. Over Malta, on October 23rd, 16 Macchi C.202s from 501 Stormo attempted to intercept a formation of Spitfire Mark IXs, providing top cover for reconnaissance aircraft. The Italian formation climbed to 22,000 feet, already near the ceiling where their fighters could maneuver effectively. The Spitfires, operating at 28,000 feet, dove onto the Macchis, with speed advantage exceeding 100 miles per hour. The engagement lasted less than 3 minutes. British fighters fired brief bursts during their high-speed passes, then climbed away before the Italians could respond. 3 Folgores went down immediately. 2 more suffered battle damage severe enough to force emergency landings. The Spitfires disappeared back to altitude. Italian pilots exhausted their ammunition firing at targets that were already beyond effective range, climbing away on superior power. The after-action report noted with frustration that the British refused to engage in turning combat where Italian advantages might matter. Similar patterns emerged across other fronts. In North Africa, where Macchi units supported Rommel's forces, Italian fighters found themselves increasingly ineffective against Allied air superiority operations. P-40 Kitty Hawks, though inferior to the Folgore in turning performance, learned to fight vertically. American pilots used diving attacks from altitude, building speed the Macchi could not match, firing during a single pass, then climbing away on superior power. Italian pilots could turn inside the American fighters but could not force engagements where turning mattered. The doctrine that had sustained Italian fighter operations for 2 years proved increasingly obsolete. Regia Aeronautica training emphasized visual combat, tight formation flying requiring constant communication, and dogfighting skills that exploited the Macchis' superior maneuverability. Pilots learned to force turning battles where their lighter, more agile fighters could dominate, but Allied air forces refused to cooperate. They fought from altitude, used speed instead of turning, and exploited performance advantages Italian fighters could not counter. The industrial gap amplified every tactical disadvantage. Britain's manufacturing base produced Spitfires at a rate exceeding Italian fighter production by a factor of 5. American factories were just beginning to reach full war production, with hundreds of P-38s, P-47s, and P-51s entering service monthly. Germany, though allied with Italy, jealously guarded its limited Daimler-Benz engine production for Luftwaffe needs. Alfa Romeo struggled to produce 50 RA1000 engines monthly, a fraction of British Merlin output. Quality control problems plagued Italian production. The captured Spitfire demonstrated manufacturing consistency Italian factories could not match. Every rivet sat flush, every control surface aligned precisely. Panel gaps measured in fractions of millimeters. Surface finish was smooth enough that boundary layer remained laminar across significant portions of the wing. British aircraft came off production lines as near-identical copies, each performing within tight tolerances of published specifications. Italian fighters showed disturbing variation between individual aircraft. Some Folgores flew beautifully, meeting or exceeding specification. Others suffered from misaligned control surfaces, rough panel joints, and engines that never quite delivered rated power. Pilots learned which serial numbers to avoid. Maintenance crews worked miracles, keeping temperamental aircraft operational with limited spare parts and tool access. The industrial ecosystem that sustained British air power simply did not exist in Italy's overstretched economy. Pilot training revealed another systemic gap. RAF Fighter Command rotated experienced pilots through operational training units, where they taught new pilots the tactics and techniques that worked in combat. British pilot training emphasized energy management, altitude discipline, and systematic exploitation of aircraft strengths. New pilots arrived at frontline squadrons already familiar with the high-speed vertical fighting that maximized Spitfire performance. Italian training remained focused on pre-war doctrine. Student pilots learned formation flying, aerobatics, and dogfighting techniques perfected during the Spanish Civil War. Little emphasis on altitude operations, minimal training in high-speed combat, almost no instruction in the vertical fighting that Allied pilots employed increasingly. Italian pilots arrived at operational squadrons skilled in tactics that no longer worked, flying aircraft optimized for a kind of combat that was disappearing from Mediterranean skies. The ammunition differential compounded every other problem. British fighters carried enough ammunition for sustained engagements lasting several minutes. Spitfire pilots could take multiple firing passes, learning and adjusting their aim without worrying about running dry. Italian pilots faced constant ammunition discipline requirements. The Folgore's Breda Safat guns, though effective when they connected, provided only brief opportunities to score kills. Pilots learned to hold fire until point-blank range, often missing chances that British pilots would take freely. The firepower gap grew worse as combat intensified. Allied bombers increasingly featured heavy defensive armament and robust structures that absorbed significant battle damage. B-17 flying fortresses carried 13 50 caliber machine guns and could remain airborne despite catastrophic structural damage. To stop these formations required heavy cannon fire delivered with precision. The Folgore's twin 12.7mm guns proved woefully inadequate against four-engine bombers. Italian pilots attempting bomber interception faced an impossible equation. They needed to close to point-blank range to inflict meaningful damage with their light armament. But closing meant flying through concentrated defensive fire from multiple bomber gun positions. The unarmored Macchi offered no protection. A single 50 caliber round striking the fuel tank meant instant conflagration. Italian fighter units suffered horrific casualties attempting to stop American bomber formations over Sicily and southern Italy during 1943. The psychological impact of the Guidonia evaluation rippled through Italian aviation circles during late 1942. Senior pilots who reviewed the test data understood immediately what the numbers meant. The comfortable belief that Italian fighters could match Allied types evaporated under systematic analysis. The Macchi C.202 remained a beautiful aircraft, beloved by its pilots, genuinely competitive in specific tactical regimes. But those regimes were disappearing as Allied air forces moved higher, faster, and more numerous. Development of improved variants offered little hope. The Macchi C.205 Veltro, fitted with the more powerful Daimler-Benz 605 engine, promised better high-altitude performance. But Alfa Romeo's production capacity meant only a handful would reach operational squadrons before Italy's military collapse. The Fiat G55 Centauro, arguably Italy's best fighter design, entered production too late and in too small numbers to affect the strategic situation. German evaluation teams at Guidonia in early 1943 were impressed by Italian Series 5 fighters but declined to divert limited engine production from Luftwaffe needs. The strategic situation deteriorated rapidly through 1943. Allied air superiority over Sicily became absolute by May. American and British fighters flew thousands of sorties daily, overwhelming Italian and German opposition through sheer numerical advantage. The few remaining Macchi units fought with desperate courage but could not stem the tide. By the time Allied forces invaded Sicily in July 1943, Italian fighter strength had been systematically destroyed through attrition against an enemy that could replace losses far faster than Italy could manufacture replacements. Combat reports from the final months before Italy's armistice reflected resigned acceptance of tactical inferiority. Pilots no longer claimed the Folgore matched the Spitfire. After-action summaries noted that successful engagements occurred only when Italian fighters achieved surprise against isolated British aircraft at low altitude. Any sustained combat at altitude resulted in Italian losses. Macchi units adopted increasingly defensive tactics, husbanding their dwindling fighter strength against bomber formations while ceding air superiority to Allied fighters. The September 8, 1943 armistice found the Regia Aeronautica shattered. Operational fighter strength had declined to fewer than 200 aircraft across all fronts. Many pilots flew their aircraft to Allied-controlled airfields and joined the co-belligerent air force fighting alongside the Allies against Germany. Others continued flying for the Italian Social Republic in northern Italy, now equipped primarily with German fighters. The Macchi C.202, once the pride of Italian fighter aviation, faded into obsolescence. Post-war analysis confirmed what Guidonia's testing had revealed in 1942. The Spitfire represented a different design philosophy, one that prioritized combat effectiveness over elegance. British engineers accepted weight penalties for armor, self-sealing tanks, and heavy armament because combat experience proved these features saved pilot lives and won battles. The additional power needed to maintain performance despite added weight came from engines British industry could produce reliably and in quantity. Italian designers, working under severe industrial constraints, made different choices. The Macchi C.202 achieved its impressive performance through systematic weight reduction. No armor, no fuel tank protection. Minimum gauge structures. Light armament. These trade-offs produced a fighter that excelled in specific tactical regimes but proved increasingly vulnerable as combat intensity increased and Allied air forces exploited their systematic advantages. The climb rate disparity that Colonnello Tondi measured at Guidonia in September 1942 symbolized a broader technological and industrial gap. The 40% difference in climb performance above 20,000 feet reflected not just engineering choices, but entire nations' industrial capacity, quality control standards, and systematic approaches to combat aviation. Italy built beautiful fighters with the resources available. Britain built fighters optimized for winning the specific kind of air war that was actually being fought. The captured Spitfire remained at Guidonia through Italy's surrender, a physical reminder of what systematic engineering and industrial might could achieve. Some Italian pilots who flew it during evaluation flights later joined the co-belligerent Air Force and received Spitfire Mark Vs from Allied stocks. They discovered in operational service what the test flights had suggested. The British fighter was heavier, less nimble at low speeds, less elegant in its flying qualities than the beloved Macchi, but it won fights, could take punishment, could climb above opponents and dictate engagement terms, could survive long enough for pilot skill to matter. By 1944, as Allied forces pushed northward through Italy, former Regia Aeronautica pilots flying Spitfires encountered their erstwhile comrades still flying Macchis for the Italian Social Republic. The engagements proved bitterly one-sided. Pilots who understood both aircraft exploited the Spitfire's high-altitude dominance ruthlessly. The Macchi pilots, skilled and brave, fought with the same aircraft and tactics that had seemed so promising in 1941. But the war had moved past them. Italian pilots who transitioned to Spitfires noted the differences immediately. The British fighter felt solid, almost heavy compared to the responsive Macchi. Control pressures were higher. The aircraft demanded more physical effort to maneuver, but at 15,000 feet and above, it came alive. The Merlin engine pulled strongly throughout the altitude band. Controls remained effective at speeds where the Macchi became dangerously unresponsive. The additional weight in armor and fuel protection proved its worth during the inevitable moments when enemy fire found its mark. The ammunition load made the biggest psychological difference. Former Macchi pilots accustomed to carefully rationed bursts found themselves with ammunition to spare. They could take deflection shots that would have been unthinkable in a Folgore, could fire multiple bursts during an engagement without fear of running dry. The Hispano cannons, though prone to jamming issues, delivered devastating firepower when they worked. A single 2-second burst could shred a Macchi C.202's unprotected structure. The final combat statistics told the brutal story. Macchi C.202 units achieved respectable kill-to-loss ratios during 1941 and early 1942, when combat occurred primarily at low altitudes, where the type's strengths emerged. But from mid-1942 onward, as Allied fighters adopted high-altitude tactics and operated in overwhelming numerical superiority, Italian losses mounted catastrophically. Final estimates suggest fewer than 15% of Macchi C.202 pilots who entered combat survived to war's end. The industrial comparison proved equally stark. Britain produced approximately 20,000 Spitfires across all variants during the war. Italy manufactured approximately 1,500 Macchi C.202s, with production limited by engine availability and industrial capacity. The numerical disparity, combined with systematic performance advantages above 15,000 feet, made Italian fighter defense increasingly futile. By 1943, Italian pilots fought knowing they could not win, only delay the inevitable. The lessons learned at Guidonia influenced post-war Italian aviation development profoundly. When Italy rebuilt its air force during the 1950s, emphasis shifted away from lightweight, highly maneuverable fighters toward robust aircraft with strong engines and comprehensive protective systems. Italian designers who had built the elegant but vulnerable Macchi fighters of World War II created the Fiat G91, a jet trainer fighter that prioritized survivability and system reliability over pure performance metrics. The captured Spitfire that revealed these truths disappeared during the chaos of Italy's surrender. Some reports suggest German forces captured it during their occupation of Rome and transported it north. Other accounts indicate it was destroyed during Allied bombing of Guidonia in mid-1943. Either way, its brief service at Italy's premier test centre provided the data that Italian aviation authorities needed, but were perhaps reluctant to fully acknowledge. Colonnello Angelo Tondi survived the war and later commanded Italy's post-war experimental flight test centre. In interviews during the 1960s, he reflected on the Guidonia Spitfire evaluation with characteristic precision. The British fighter, he noted, represented a systematic approach to combat aviation that Italy's limited industrial base could not replicate. The Macchi C.202 had been a beautiful solution to a problem Italian engineers understood clearly. But war, he observed, rewards not elegant solutions but effective ones. The climb rate numbers remained the most telling metric. That 40% advantage above 20,000 feet meant British fighters could control the altitude band where modern combat occurred, could dive with crushing speed advantage, could climb away after firing passes before Italian fighters could respond. The vertical battlefield belonged to aircraft with power to spare and structures built to handle high-speed maneuvering. The Macchi C.202, optimized for low-altitude turning combat, found itself fighting in conditions where its advantages meant nothing. Italian pilots who flew both types in combat often expressed conflicted feelings about the comparison. The Macchi was more enjoyable to fly, more responsive, more connected to the pilot's inputs. It rewarded skill and demanded finesse. The Spitfire felt more workmanlike, less graceful, heavier in control. But when combat began, when altitude and speed mattered more than elegance, the British fighter's systematic advantages proved decisive. Pilots learned to appreciate that the aircraft keeping them alive mattered more than the one that felt best during peacetime flying. The ammunition disparity illustrated broader philosophical differences between Italian and British approaches to fighter design. Italian designers, constrained by limited production capacity and industrial resources, minimized everything not absolutely essential to flight performance. Light armament meant less weight, better climb rate, tighter turns. British designers, operating within a massive industrial ecosystem, accepted weight penalties to maximize combat effectiveness. Heavy armament, comprehensive armor, redundant systems all reduced pure performance but increased the probability of mission success and pilot survival. These choices reflected different strategic situations. Italy entered the war expecting quick victories through superior pilot skill and tactical finesse. Fighter doctrine emphasized individual combat prowess, tight formation flying, and dogfighting techniques that exploited aircraft maneuverability. Limited industrial capacity meant Italy could not sustain prolonged attrition warfare. Each aircraft lost represented a significant fraction of total production capacity. Pilots could not be replaced quickly. Italian strategy required winning decisively with limited resources. Britain, by contrast, faced an existential struggle, requiring sustained industrial output over years of combat. Fighter doctrine evolved to maximize the advantage of numerical superiority and systematic replacement of losses. Tactics that preserved pilot lives and aircraft took priority over achieving maximum performance. RAF Fighter Command could afford to accept casualties because replacement pilots and aircraft would arrive continuously. The strategic calculus favoured robust aircraft that could survive damage over elegant fighters that might achieve marginal performance advantages. The Guidonia testing crystallised these differences with uncomfortable clarity. The 40% climb rate advantage above 20,000 feet represented not just superior supercharging, but entirely different design philosophies, backed by vastly different industrial capabilities. Italian engineers had done remarkable work producing the Macchi C.202 under severe constraints, but excellence within constraints could not overcome the systematic advantages available to opponents operating without those limitations. Some Italian aviation historians argue that with more powerful engines and time to develop improved variants, Italian fighters could have competed effectively against Allied types. The Macchi C.205 and Fiat G55 showed promise during limited combat service. But this argument ignores the fundamental industrial disparity. Even if Italian designers could match Allied fighter performance, Italy lacked the production capacity to manufacture competitive aircraft in meaningful numbers. The Allied advantage was not merely technological but systemic. The final irony lay in the Macchi C.202's actual combat record. Despite its limitations at altitude, despite its vulnerability to battle damage, despite its light armament, the Folgore achieved respectable results when employed according to its strengths. Italian pilots who understood their aircraft's capabilities and fought at low altitude, in visual conditions, using surprise and maneuverability, could still defeat Allied fighters. The aircraft was not inherently bad. It was optimized for conditions that no longer existed in 1943 Mediterranean skies. By war's end, approximately 1,100 Macchi C.202s had been destroyed in combat or lost to accidents. Perhaps 200 survived Italy's surrender, scattered across airfields from southern France to the Balkans. Most were scrapped during post-war years. A handful survived as gate guards or museum pieces. One beautifully restored example hangs in the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, bearing the markings of 90 Squadriglia, Decimo Gruppo, Quarto Stormo. Visitors walking beneath its elegant wings see one of history's most beautiful fighters, a machine that represented Italian aviation's finest effort with available resources. They do not see the test pilot's notes from Guidonia, documenting the climb rate data that revealed uncomfortable truths. Do not see the combat reports noting the frustrated inability to pursue climbing British fighters. Do not see the casualty statistics showing what happened when elegant design met systematic industrial power. The preserved Macchi shows only the beauty of its lines, the graceful elliptical wings, the streamlined fuselage housing the German engine that briefly closed Italy's performance gap with frontline fighters. The captured Spitfire that revealed these truths has vanished from history. No photographs survive showing it in Italian markings at Guidonia. No detailed test reports document Colonnello Tondi's systematic evaluation flights. The knowledge it provided influenced Italian aviation understanding, but arrived too late to affect Italy's military trajectory. By the time Italian engineers fully understood what systematic testing revealed, Italy's strategic position had deteriorated beyond recovery. Knowledge without power to act on that knowledge provided only bitter understanding. The story of the Guidonia Spitfire represents more than a technical comparison between two fighter aircraft. It illustrates the broader narrative of industrial warfare, where systematic advantages in production capacity, quality control, and technological sophistication proved as decisive as tactical skill or individual courage. Italian pilots flying Macchi C.202s were brave, skilled, and dedicated. Their aircraft represented excellent engineering under severe constraints, but courage and skill could not overcome a 40% climb rate disadvantage above 20,000 feet when your opponent controlled the altitude, dictated engagement terms, and arrived in overwhelming numbers. The Macchi C.202 Folgore remains beloved by aviation enthusiasts for its beauty and for what it represented, Italy's determination to field competitive fighters despite limited industrial resources. The Spitfire Mark V, less elegant but more effective, symbolizes the systematic approach to combat aviation that characterized British industrial mobilization. Both aircraft were products of their nation's capabilities and strategic situations. One was beautiful, the other won. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.